All right. Hey, Steve. Welcome to Portland. So you're one of there's a few of the original kind of members of SPG that I haven't had a podcast with, and you're one of them. So I'm glad to get this chance to do it. And you and I were talking the other day, and I think you've been part of SPG now for 17 years.
Yeah, I think it's just about to be 17 years.
Just about to be 17 years. So you've seen a lot of the evolution and changes that have happened with the coaches and the organization as a whole. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you first came to SPG and then what you've seen as far as the changes over the last 17 years?
Right. So, as I started to meet the other coaches when I first joined the organization, I found we all had a similar story. So a lot of us came from either a classical martial arts background or had moved from that into JKD, or it started with JKD. JKD either original or concepts or both. And obviously everybody kind of interested in an evolution because they got to that point. But then we started to see some of the flaws with the JKD community, which is basically reproducing the same problems as the classical martial arts, right? Dead patterns, not understanding aliveness, more collectors than going in depth into functional martial arts. And around that time that I started to have these conflicts, and I realized, when I was doing live training, certain things worked, certain things never did, or very rarely did.
Wow.
Then I saw an ad on a video, or you were commenting on one of Burton Richardson's videos, and then I saw an ad, and so I had a couple exposures, a Black Belt magazine, I think. And so my immediate thing was, especially because back then you were pretty blunt, to say the least, with your delivery. So I was just like, yeah, I mean, this guy gets it. And so before I even met you, I had, with my current instructor, who again had some great components to the program that I was in, but then some of it was still that old technology, or the dead pattern technology. So I kind of made a pitch to him about how we could make the shift over to what now I would call a live functional training.
Right.
And there was a little bit of resistance to it at that time because, again, the UFC hadn't really taken hold as a formal sport yet. It was still in its early stages, and just people didn't quite understand it yet. But I knew I had this itch. So the first thing I did when I started my own program, so I was one of the early people in Massachusetts. Basically, there was jiu-jitsu. There was a few places to learn jiu-jitsu. The one was with my instructor Roberto Maya, who's a godfather of jiu-jitsu in New England. Now there's tons, but he was the first guy. And then there was some places to do striking, and that was about it.
No.
And then as far as places where you would get an integrated curriculum, there were only fight clubs back then. So when I started my own satellite program, I wanted to be able to make functional training, all the different components of it, accessible to everybody. First thing I did when I did that was contact you and bring you out, because I liked your message. So that's why I've always said you're kind of like the Pied Piper voice that brought everybody together that had similar experiences. And then that's what brought us to SPG. So for me, SPG was about the place where you've got all the things that we have now, but I saw that in its early stages, right? We've got the self-defense, stand-up clinch and ground, and to be able to make those scalable to people of all different interests. They're not just fighters, they're not just law enforcement, they're not just recreational people, it's everybody.
Right. And what big changes have you noticed maybe in the last decade?
Right. So there was a shift. It started off, and honestly, you see the movement when people follow the leader to some extent. So I know that you were initially you wanted fighting in all ranges, and that was what you were personally interested in. So this steered the course a little bit because you started the first gym, and then you started the organization direction. So then when I think you got more interested in focusing your time and energy in the depth of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I saw a little shift there with everybody else. But now I feel like it's opened up full circle, and all the different expertises and skill sets from all the core coaches have sort of come back into the mix. And now we're all more interested in the common threads that translate from one domain, whether it's self-defense, even tactical self-defense like Paul Sharp will do, all the way through to sport jiu-jitsu, MMA, Vale Tudo, self-defense on the street. like all those different things now. We're interested in the things that make functional martial arts transcend wherever domain, like it's the commonalities.
Right.
So.
You were one of the pioneers in updating our business practices. One thing I'm always grateful to you for and giving you credit for, because when you first started, I used to give you a bit of a hard time. But then you'd always have a rational reason why you were doing what you were doing, and you were very patient and explained it, and eventually won me over. And you and I had that conversation with Travis in Mexico, which we talked about on the podcast before. And Travis's initial reaction, which we talked about when he was on the podcast, was he was a little bit angry. And I was a little bit defensive at first, of course, actually for a long time.
Yeah.
And now everybody's on board, and I think what we've all realized, I mean, for me, that was almost exactly 10 years ago that I made that switch. And the gym here is night and day, both in terms of membership, which is 5 times what it used to be, but also just the vibe. As it is at your place, we have, men, women, children. It's a family gym, and my competitive athletes have never been better. Right. And so the thing that I try to explain to everybody else and some of the newer coaches that are coming up into the gym is that best practices in terms of business and best practices in terms of creating world-class athletes or fighters or people who can use functional material are never in conflict.
No.
And I think that part of the resistance people have to it is they assume that they are.
Yeah.
I think that there's a knee-jerk reaction that people think that if you're going to be good at business, and by definition somehow you're not serving your customer, when in reality it's exactly the opposite.
Right.
So if you were to go back, and let's say you and I could rewind the clock to 9 years ago, and we're in Mexico and we're having that conversation with Travis, how would you approach that, or is there a way that you would approach a conversation like that differently now with another coach who maybe hasn't realized the value of spending as much time on a good community and a good business as you do on jiu-jitsu? How would you have that conversation now?
Right. It probably wouldn't be radically different because I think if I remember correctly,
You handled it well. I'm not saying you did.
Yeah. I get what you're asking, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what the resistance there is that we tend to be looking through the lenses of a particular perspective we have at a given moment in time as coaches,
Right.
and as athletes,
Right.
first of all, and also as instructors. So we have this, people talk about putting on black belt glasses,
Right.
where you look at everything according to, if I'm a gnarly competitive black belt and whatever, right? Jiu-jitsu, whatever else, then I start more or less consciously installing my own value system and relationship to martial arts onto my students,
Right.
which will of course exclude a lot of them,
Right.
and make it inaccessible to a lot of them. It's the same thing we talk about with trying to teach your own style, right? When it comes down to mechanics, like you're teaching your style, you're alienating everybody who doesn't have the same attributes as you.
Right.
So in that sense, I kind of say, look, you've got a lens on right now for how you think the relationship should be, but that's going to change over time, just as you've seen your relationship to the art change over time. A lot of people's motivations change with age and experience, and especially once you start coaching, your shift goes more into coaching. Even if you still compete, your relationship to it is mostly different in most cases, right? So I would just say, look at that and understand that your main thing is not to impose your ideological stance right now. Your main objective is to create a community, and within that community, you also need to support yourself and your family. And if you have a good systems base, you're going to deal with a lot less of the issues. You're going to create a more stable environment for everybody, and you're going to also be able to provide a better facility and all those benefits to that, because you're not just going to be teaching out of a ramshackle hole in the wall that the heat doesn't work and the bathrooms, it's going to be decent, and that you can continue to do it, and you're not going to get shut down because you're living literally month to month. I mean,
provide services to more people.
Exactly.
Provide what we do that benefits people to even more people.
Yeah, you can make it more accessible. There's nothing inherently bad about being able to make a living. There were things things, certainly if you wanted to get rich, you could do different than this, but you should be able to at least support yourself and make a decent living doing what you love. And we put a lot of time and effort into not only providing good instruction, or excellent instruction, one would hope, but also providing a really good service and building a community. And we know that that community has the opportunity, as we've seen, to change not only our lives, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it, but also everybody else's life. I mean, people have gotten married, they've formed their best friends, people they never would have come across had they not been in this environment.
Right, that they hang out with for 17 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't you think, too, we don't have to go too far into this, but at a kind of a meta level, society-wise, people who haven't ever been entrepreneurs or run small businesses sometimes have just a general negative reaction to business, which is, you know, when you actually look into the data, it's actually backwards, because there's nothing that's pulled people out of our natural state, which is overall horrible, grinding poverty, more than free exchange of goods and services.
Right.
But I don't necessarily think that message gets out to people in our educational system, K through 12, and it's certainly not something that's usually talked about in college unless you're going to business school. So I think that could just be part of it too.
Yeah, I think it is. And, you know, you do see that sometimes. I mean, it's well known among school owners, and I'm sure there's very similar dynamics amongst conversations that take place in other industries. But I've seen it before. I mean, most people, your members will, if they get it, they appreciate you. But, you know, we've all dealt with the instances where somebody will be in your office one day with the door closed saying, you know, I had this horrible life circumstances, and if I hadn't found this and I hadn't found you, I don't know if I'd be alive right now, or something like that. I've literally had people, you know, in tears thanking me, and I'm thanking them back for being part of the community. And then the moment that something is inconvenient for them, you're a vendor. Right. You know, we've all had that happen too. It's unfortunate, but it speaks to that little bit of a lack of respect.
They're a tiny minority.
Tiny minority.
Everybody runs into it.
Everybody has that. But I think, you know, sometimes there is that just general thing where as soon as you need to articulate that the time and energy that you're appreciating when it's good for you is in fact that value in exchange for services, right? That's what money is. It's just a symbol for exchange of value. Right. That works both ways. Yes. You know, that we need to have that in place in order to provide the thing that you want when you want it.
Good. Another thing you and I both noticed is, you know, my initial introduction to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as I've talked about before on different interviews, came via Fabio Santos, who was a student of Holes and Hickson. And then my instructor after that was Hickson. And so I got that a benefit, I guess, of that early introduction to Jiu-Jitsu, what I perceive to be what I think is the highest level. And then it became hard to train with Hickson just personally for me. And I was fortunate enough to run into my coach, Chris Howder, which we all know and love Chris, and he's been my coach since then. And he had the same experience. He was trained with Hickson early on, and just by circumstance of how things divided up in the garage, which we talked about with Chris, he wound up going with Hegan. But in the last, I guess, 6 years, a lot of the senior coaches, myself and you and John Frankel and others, have come full circle and kind of gotten back to Hickson's Jiu-Jitsu. We were going there as an organization before I met with Hickson again recently, you know, a couple years ago when I reconnected with Hickson, but all of us kind of just organically evolved into a simpler and simpler delivery system. Right. And now we're all kind of trying to pull that information from Hickson and from friends like Henry and other people. And it's remarkable that I never need to have a conversation with you or John or Glenn in England or any of the other coaches that are on this kind of page. We're all doing the same thing. Yes. And then when we get together, we compare notes. But I think it's kind of fascinating how that evolution occurred, and what do you attribute that journey to?
Right. Well, obviously, ideologically, it's aligned with SBG anyway, because we're always into trying to, you know, disseminate and distill the information down to fundamentals.
And that's where aliveness came from.
Exactly. And obviously, you know, some of the things that you've talked about, you know, like the isolation training, which you articulated in his pieces with the I method, that was something Hickson said, you know, like this is how I train so I can still be able to, you know, train live with like world champions and shut them down, even though I only have my own students to work with, you know, like you talk about these things. So it's already, I think it was already in there, but the thing is, there was that period, as I understand it, of about, you know, maybe call it 15 years or so, that Rickson went from just being great at jiu-jitsu, kind of the family champion, and also obviously had the physicality and everything, but really worked out kind of the next evolution for what his grandfather contributed with all the more sophisticated leverages and everything that we know as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today, and really added the connection to everything. And I think the thing that I've said this many times before to people privately, but just for the podcast, when you did the interview with Rickson on your podcast, you asked the question that I wanted to hear. Nobody else has asked it. Talk to me about connection, why it's so important, you know, invisible jiu-jitsu, what is all this? And he said, in that, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, you know, there's a lot of high-level jiu-jitsu, but even within that, even people like winning high-level technique, high-level world championships, like I still see a lot of partial connection. What I did was I went through all the positions and techniques of jiu-jitsu, and I created the full connection. And that's a lofty, grandiose statement, but to me, it blew me away, because I'm like, that's amazing, you know? And that's what I'm interested in. And now, you know, Rickson's out doing seminars, so you get to see that, and then you can extrapolate from, you know, not just limited to what he's showing, but you can extrapolate that into other areas. Henry's doing it. So I think, you know, the initiation for me is, some years ago, I trained closely with Kenny Florian for a long time, and he was down at the, you know, Gracie Barra down in Brazil. His brother, well, I don't know if his brother did, but anyway, Kenny did a bit of training because he was there in Brazil at the same time as Henry, and they met up a couple times. He would come back and kind of show me some of these principles in the tweaks.
He got from Henry?
He got from Henry, which obviously came from Rickson during the peak years.
Oh, okay.
The connection years, right?
Okay.
And then some of those things made it into our curriculum.
Okay.
And then I'm always...
Like the hands on the feet, is that where that came from?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Interested in that. And then from there, Henry started going out and doing seminars. So I met him at a business conference years ago. He said he was going to start teaching this stuff. And it was a couple years before he and Scotty from On the Mat came out with it. But then they started releasing this material, because basically Henry's thing was, this is going to be lost.
Right.
You know, like I've got to pass it on.
Right.
So I had
Which
the
is
opportunity. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I had the opportunity to have, when Henry came to the East Coast the first time, I believe, was Philly.
Yeah.
And I made the trip there, spent a couple days with him, instantly hit it off, and you know, my mind was just buzzing with connections. You know, like, pardon the pun.
Once you get the concept, you can see where it goes
Exactly.
everywhere.
So then I've had him. So this was over 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then I've had him out since, and you know, it's just I'm obsessed with, basically, to me that's like a before and after. You know, like the BC for me of jiu-jitsu is before connection.
Yeah.
You know, and then after, and that's what that's what I'm you know, fascinated with. And then, you know, then the thing would be like, well, most people would say, but you have to train with Rickson for that to be useful, or you know, or you have to train with one of his immediate black belts that, you know, are familiar with these differences in the fundamental techniques. And I don't think so. You know, I think we're so good at extrapolating concepts and then reintroducing them to students through the filter of our training methodology that, you know, we have tremendous amount of value that we can bring. That
unless you're positing something supernatural, there'd be no reason why you'd have to directly train with it. But Henry's big, in addition to the fact that he had spent so much time with Rickson, so of course he has those volumes of information, and you know, his body is can perform it as well. I think the big advantage Henry has that a lot of the other black belts don't have, and I think to some degree we have a bit of it in jiu-jitsu only for sheer fortune of how I started, is he knows how good Rickson was.
Yes.
And by sheer fortune of how I started, so do I, and so does Howder.
Right.
You know, there are people, young black belts these days, who, no, it's kind of
they don't
funny.
believe it.
They don't believe it, and they might not even know. It's kind of funny, a few years ago when we were at Mundials for a competition, one of my black belts, Amanda, was, outside, showing her black belt to go inside the pyramid there. And Hickson walked up, and people sitting at the desk didn't know who he was. They were giving him a hard time about going in. And she's explaining to him, that's Hickson Gracie. And they're like, well, do you have your IBJJF card, you know? And she said, that's Cron's dad. And then they're like, oh,
that guy.
that
Oh, he's an old school guy.
yeah. So I think it's just there's a generational aspect to that too.
Right. And I mean, a lot of the top competitors today, I think it's just sort of like a respectful nod to the guy who used to be the man.
Yeah.
But it's missing the point. You know, like as we were talking about, when it comes to the technique, I look at it as, you know, the branches and nodes that grow off of. Here's a fundamental technique, right? We also talk about fundamentals more broadly in terms of posture, pressure, body position, everything, which is more important. But when we talk about like sort of the basic techniques you learn to be able to play the game,
right?
And then people say, okay, but once somebody gets good at this, then those don't work anymore. So now we have to come up with this answer, and then people adapt to that, and all of a sudden it starts branching out, and you get these layers of sophistication, all these new modernized games, none of which are wrong or bad in and of themselves, because clearly they're effective even at high levels. But then how is it that for real, verified over and over again, the people who are the very top, multiple sometimes world champions would go in at the peak when he was only in California training with his own students, and they go in and he'd smash them using quote unquote white belt jiu-jitsu.
Right.
How is that possible? And how is it repeatable with all these different guys who had totally different games?
Right.
And by their own admission, even guys who had big egos and stuff, you know, they would say, yeah, he smashed me.
Yeah. Not because they want to.
Right. Yes. Not because they wanted to feed into the legend. Right. The reason he was able to do that is because he had such a greater depth of understanding of those basics that they weren't just basics. Like there's an ocean of possibility. You know, it's like lying underneath the surface, and that's the connection. That's what he was able to understand and able to take away all those possibilities and all those branches and nodes. You know, he just deny you that from the root,
right,
and swallow it up, and then able to impose his will. So it's not to say that, you know, from talking to Henry, it's not to say that he wouldn't have competitive roles. He'd be presented with problems and get like entangled or something, but then he would just figure it out because of his understanding of jiu-jitsu at its core.
Right. One other thing we should talk about too, you are, for people that don't know, one of the highest ranking or higher ranking Muay Thai instructors in the country. You've been training for, how long have you been training with Mark Delagrati?
I've been with Mark for as long as with SBG, so it's been about like a good 16 years.
16 years you've been training with Mark. And I think most of our viewers probably know who Mark Delagrati is, but he's a very famous stand-up coach who's well known for his fighters in the UFC. But I think, you know, looking around and talking to the different coaches and the different MMA gyms around the world, the thing that right now is like, if you have great stand-up skills at coaching and you can teach people to stand up without incurring brain damage, you are a valued commodity in this community right now, because that's somewhat rare. I mean, we're coming out of the era where really the only people, we talked about this yesterday, but when you and I were talking, but you know, the only people that I know that really know how to hold pads well are some of the old school boxing coaches. And for them, teaching is more like an apprenticeship. So they're passing it on to very few select people who also do that job.
It's the same in Thai boxing gyms.
And then you've got the old guys in the Thai boxers in Thailand who are geniuses with that. But outside that, it really breaks down and becomes usually silly. I mean, most of the glove drills we'd see, the focusment drills we'd see in JKD were downright goofy.
Yeah, sometimes you can be at a high level pro MMA event and you see the holding going on in the back. It's very rudimentary. So
talk to us a little bit about the crossover between how everyone that's watching this podcast and is a fan of SBG or a student of SBG knows how much we value fundamentals. But usually we're, probably a fault of my own, but we're usually articulating that through the medium of jiu-jitsu.
Right.
So talk to us about how you can do the same thing with stand-up.
Right. So when we talk about posture, pressure, possibilities, connection even to some extent, these things, for me, you know, a lot of people will draw a large concentric circle around the smaller circles of the grappling arts and to say it's all kind of one, right? They're just different interpretations of grappling.
Right.
But for me, really any alive athletic competitive area is really one, if you want to look at it that way, because our body moves in certain ways and it can't move in other ways, right? So you talk about the different functional planes of movement, force vectors and everything, and kinetic chain, you know, the same way that I optimize a golf swing, you know, a baseball, hitting a baseball bat, you know, throwing a punch, they're all differences, but they're all largely related. And
Related to connection as well.
relating to connection. And sometimes when you're unattached to, so in striking, you have superior position, even if you're not touching somebody, right? And that's what keeps you safe and also gives you the angles of attack. Your connection in some cases when you're not making contact with somebody is to the earth. And that's where the kinetic chain starts always. So, you know, the fundamentals there, if you really put your primary emphasis on developing proper posture, how to move out of that posture, and then optimizing all your offensive and defensive tools relative to distance management, angles, and develop timing and everything. And you do that in a relaxed way so that you can control what you're doing, and you take the CTE, you take the brain damage seriously, then you can really build high levels of skill with great body mechanics and great timing. And all you need to do is add the pop if you're actually in a competitive situation or in a, you know, in a self-defense situation or something like that. Your distancing will be correct. You're not like pulling your punches, so you know, you're training yourself not to throw properly. All you need to do is have, like, again, if you had great pad holding, your distancing is going to be good. You can put all the pop you want. You can work the bags and everything. And then when you're training with people, it's softer, but your mechanics are there. So all you need to, you know, at any moment, if you want to put the power into it, you can do it.
Right.
And I've seen this repeated over and over again. I mean, in Thailand, you get little kids that will, from the time that they're, you know, 8, 10, 12 years old, they're going to train because that's how they're going to feed their families. That's one way that they can get
It's their job.
taken care of. It becomes their job. They got to fight.
Right.
So to save themselves for competing, which is often, you know, every month, sometimes even multiple times a month,
Right.
you can't beat yourself up in training. We can extrapolate that same principle for different reasons over here. For us, it's not to save ourselves for the fight we're going to have every couple weeks. For us, it's I got to go to work the next day. I got to make sure I can, you know, not be drooling so I can still take care of my kids, you know, and you know, I got a busy life and everything, so I want to train functionally, but I don't want to go home with headaches all the time and concussions. And as far as that goes, just my thing, I still hear people to this day say, yeah, I know you can train like that later, but first you got to learn how to take a punch. And I always I'm like stunned by that because it's like, dude, if you lift weights, you develop hypertrophy based on the tissue damage, right? And then your muscles grow.
Right.
And if you work with your hands every day, you develop calluses because your skin adapts. Your brain doesn't develop a callus. Your brain doesn't have hypertrophy, right? Your brain gets damaged, period.
Right.
So don't do that.
Right.
And it's cumulative.
John Kavanaugh had probably the best way any of us have phrased it when he talked about updating the software without damaging the hardware. And he's talked many times in interviews about how much lighter his team spars, including, you know, some of the top guys, and his guys are, of course, some of the top guys in the sport, in comparison to some of the other gyms. And I think still people just don't believe him. But if you talk to him personally about it, he'd be the first to say, you know, as you know, that it took a long time to get his team for him to be able to get his team to train the right way, using only MMA gloves.
Yes.
So maintaining the light contact, but ultimately, obviously, if you're running a fight team, that's the goal. Sometimes, of course, they put the bigger gloves on, but to be able to get a whole team that can train together like that is what any MMA coach out there, aspiring MMA coach out there, should be looking to do, to create a team where guys can train that way without hurting each other. What short piece of advice would you offer them to help expedite that process?
Right. The main thing is you need to, because you can do the same thing, and we recommend doing the same thing with grappling with isolation training, right? Where it's progressive resistance, but the consequences are greater. Now, you may jack up your joints and everything if you train rough all the time and you get into patterns where you kind of just have an A game, but you've got a lot of holes because it's just fight or flight. But in contact, right, it's your head, it's your brain. So the consequences are greater for striking, but you need to approach it the same way, right? You develop great fundamentals with your tools. Then you need to isolate so you're getting your movement, your range with partners. So as you translate from, say, static technique, just making sure you can hit the bag or you can shadow box or whatever, work on pads with simple mechanics and combos. You get all those things great, your kick is good. Then you need to be able to add the movement and the distancing and the timing and the angles and all of that. And the only way to do that is to do it slow and correct without snapping anybody's head back. And it takes two to tango. And as a coach, you have to create the environment where basically it's not you're constantly telling guys to slow down, although that will happen. But what I like to look at it is, it would be almost a thing like if you were to go into a symphony hall or something during a performance and just started to make like loud, obnoxious noises. Everybody's just going to look at you like, what the fuck are you doing, right?
Culture.
So you create the culture so that is unacceptable, and it becomes self-policing, where everybody knows what they need to do to be a valuable training partner to somebody else and also to maximize their own learning.
Right.
And you start that off slow, and that becomes the established pace and pressure, and then from there, you can scale up. And usually what I train people to do is to scale up with speed before they scale up with power. And when you have the capacity to be moving and have somebody zig at the same time that you throw a punch and you thought they were going to zag, and you can still feather it back and not rock them, or at the most maybe it bloodies their nose a little bit, but it doesn't actually snap their head back, then you know you're in a good situation. When you can pull a kick on somebody's neck but not knock their head off sideways, then you know you can go that fast. Right. But you got to build it up to the point where everybody's responsible for one another's well-being.
Right. Today you taught a 2-day seminar on open guard. And when I travel around the world, questions about open guard and a conceptual way to teach open guard are one of the most common questions I get. And most of the coaches, I think, for a while now, have been working on the kind of guard that you showed, which is a connected guard. And some of the people who haven't caught up or maybe haven't been at the camps the last few years are still in the older curriculum where everybody's balled up and there's not that same connection. But with what you were doing and what you've done all weekend as far as teaching was you're actually using your weight from the bottom, which Henry also talks about a lot.
Yes.
And for everybody that's interested in that, you're going to be releasing that on SBGU, which would be awesome. But very briefly, what would you say to people would be the main advantage, the reason why you find that so important and why we've kind of switched over to that kind of open guard game?
Right. So the first major one is, if you look at the broadest, jiu-jitsu in the broadest possible terms, is a self-defense fighting art.
Right.
Even if you have no desire to get into a fight, right, it is a martial art, it's a fighting art, so you want to make sure that you're not in a position where people can reach you with strikes and they can hurt you.
Right.
So for me, that's still important. I want to make sure that if I'm training, less important that I beat somebody up than that they can't hurt me. Right. They can't put me out of commission. So this is super effective for that, because you're always out of range and you're protecting your vitals, you're protecting your head in particular, where you can get knocked out and they can do whatever they want. But the added advantage that I think is harder to see until you start playing it is that when you lose the security of the grips, which are always available for you to still re-engage at any point. You can still grab any grips and foot and hand positions you like, but when you start to create the distance, there's such a wide gulf in terms of the distance management you've created, the space between you and your opponent, that when they do start to get rid of one of your points of connection and come around or under or over or whatever, you have so much space to be able to make your hips free and then repummel your legs, that it works just as well under pure grappling sport conditions as well. It's absolutely a game changer. So I spent a good couple years just working on that particular skill set pretty much every time I rolled, and now I just see it's made my my guard's so much more effortless, so much more energy or less energy expenditure, and I just don't find myself getting.
It's a pain in the ass.
And I just don't find myself getting as jacked up
Yeah.
physically in terms of my back and everything that I used to. And I have back and neck
When
issues.
I was at your place a couple weeks ago, we did that, and you really did a good job of keeping my weight off your body. So
It's great when you're dealing with much heavier guys
phenomenal.
too. Yeah, so.
So before we end it, last thing we'll talk about real quick. You have for years now. When did you start the 40 plus?
I think it was 2011.
2011. Okay, so for 7 years you've been building this curriculum and set of instruction for older grapplers who are over the age of 40, which is a lot of our students now. Are you still active with that? And if you are, how do people get involved, and what kind of information can they get from you?
Right. So yeah, 40 plus BJJ, and basically, I mean, you know, heavily, my approach obviously is heavily influenced through the coaching methodology that we use with SBG.
Right.
And I'm just shifting the conversation to the needs of the older grapplers. And a lot of times it's a 50% technical and training methodology and 50% sort of the social dynamics and the psychology that comes into play too, because a lot of people are in academies where the environments are tailored towards the young athletic guys.
Yeah.
And they get frustrations and injuries and time constraints and things that falls into it that I address as well, because I've had a lot of experience with that too.
Right.
But really what I try and do is just make it such that people are developing a game as early as possible in their jiu-jitsu career, that they can bank what I call banking equity over time. So they're using a jiu-jitsu based on fundamentals and less in terms of techniques and technical sequences, although I show plenty of those too, but it's more in terms of what we were talking about today, so that their progress will be sustainable.
Right.
And they can also keep up with the guys who are faster, more explosive, and stronger and athletic than they are, and still continue to thrive. So they don't think like they had their glory day where they could keep up, and now it's over, and now they might as well just retire, right?
Right.
Or they get too beaten up that they can't continue.
Right.
So those are the types of people that I talk to. And there's two primary ways to find more information on my courses and my membership site and everything. One is 40plusbjj.com, so that's 40, the word plus, the word bjj.com. And the other is I have a Facebook group called 40 Plus BJJ Engage, and there's just about 13,000 as of today.
Awesome.
In there.
We'll put those URLs on the screen. I've been getting those emails for years. I love that information. It's good stuff. So look for Steve's Open Guard information in SBGU. If you're not a member, sign up. You'll be able to see that there. And if you haven't signed up and received some of the emails from his 40 Plus, definitely check that out. And thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
I'll see you soon.